everyone. My name is Debbie from NDIS Property Australia. Welcome to our first webinar of 2025. Very excited that you could all join us today. With me is Minh and Denise, and we're all going to be talking about ROI, return on investment calculations for SDA properties. I'm going to jump straight in and share my screen. Just bear with me. All right, I hope you can all see that. Before we continue, just to let you know that this, of course, does not constitute financial advice. This is just general information. Doesn't consider the needs, objectives, financial situation of anyone in particular. Consult with professionals in the financial, legal, taxation, lending world before proceeding. And you would need to get financial pre-approval before proceeding with an SDA investment. We are recording this presentation, and everybody who has signed up or joined us today will get a copy of the video within the next 48 hours. Now, if you have any questions at all, there's a little Q&A box down the bottom of your screen. Please drop your message, your question in there, and we will probably be answering the questions during the presentation, or if it's less relevant to what we're talking about, we'll come back to it at the end of the session. So I think that is that. We're just going to give you a little bit of information of who we are for those of you who may not know NDIS Property Australia. We are advisors and consultants in the SDA space in Australia. We're based in Brisbane, but we operate Australia-wide at selling and advising on SDA and NDIS property. We like to educate everybody because it's such a complex space and you really need to have a good understanding of what's going on to make wise investment or development choices in this area. We do also have a fee-for-service service in addition to selling SDA properties. And if you're interested in learning anything about SDA apart from what we're talking about today, we have a podcast channel, the SDA Housing Podcast, which has had its 280th episode drop this morning. So jump on that to get a wealth of information on anything SDA and potentially NDIS related. So without further ado, we're going to be talking today about return on investment calculations for SDA homes. Now, it's really important to understand the different kind of dwellings. Now, can I hand it over to Minh? Do you want to talk about the different kind of dwelling types we have here?
How do I start? As you can see in front of you all, everyone, there's houses, group homes, villas, and apartments. Before I go to them, Debbie, explain to us what a group home is. What is it?
A group home is obviously a group home. It is a house that has been built to house either 4 or 5 residents, in addition to the on-site supports, the carers room where a care team operates out of. The important thing to understand about group homes is that in the last year and a half or so, there's been some reviews of the NDIS or the SDA scheme. And in all of these reviews that have come out, the recommendation has been to phase out group homes. They still operate relatively institutionally. They're not giving the participants the freedom and independence to live on their own as they wish, to the extent that a house or apartment or a villa with less tenants does. So also the carers, a lot of the time, it's more difficult and more challenging to work in an environment with so many tenants in the house. So nobody wants the group homes. They will be phased out in the coming years.
Yeah. An example of a group home is, Debbie, we've spoken before in the podcast, Vic Homes in Victoria. Vic Homes is a division of the state government in Victoria. They have, I think, how many? 800 owned state homes as group homes with five participants per group home and 800 of them. That's 4,000 right there. They're all being paid for by the government as part of the government scheme. And you'll find all these government schemes in South Australia, Queensland, Victoria, Sydney, New South Wales, in looking after participants up until now. And hence the reason why the transition into SDA has been creating brand new builds or newish builds for the housing accommodation. Moving on. We've seen a lot in the last few years, a lot of 4-bedroom homes, 4 bedrooms being R.O.I carer room plus 3 residents, R for residents. That has been a lot of the majority builds the last few years. The last year and a half or so, we've seen a bit more 2 resident homes, just smaller houses to cover up the R.O.I carer plus the 2 residents. Because block sizes around Australia have been becoming lot sizes becoming more smaller in size. And as a result, we're seeing a bit more of that in the IL category as well. Across the market, across Australia, I reckon 50-50, 50% houses, 50% apartments. In comparison to, and we call that villas and duplexes, townhouses as houses as well, obviously. Debbie, do you ever see data to show the differentiation between house and villas in your data in the NDIS?
Yeah.
It isn't. Does it really show the villa side of it?
It does. It shows in terms of the supply, the data will give us the number of houses and the number of 2 resident or 3 resident houses. It will give us the data on the number of 1, 2, and 3 resident villas.
In this screen, this image right now, villas, duplex, townhouses, what's your gut feeling on the ratio between houses versus those villas, duplexes, townhouses? Do you know?
By far, Denise would probably have a handle on this too from all the data we do and the feasibilities we do, but by far more houses than anything.
Yes, majority houses, yeah.
The majority of houses. There's still quite a decent percentage of villas. And apartments are also growing in numbers.
And with the villas, we rarely see the 3 resident villas. We rarely see that. It's normally a 1 resident villa.
1 or 2.
And 2s. I reckon 2/3 as 1, and 1/3 is 2.
I think in terms of supply, I could be wrong, but I would say it's more even between 1 and 2 resident villas.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then normally robust for villas as well. The income drop between house and villa is probably 1/4, 20-25% drop in income for having a villa, duplex, townhouse as compared to a house. Yeah.
Now, why this is, I've had this question asked many, many times. Why is the income lower for villas? We have no idea. It's not that it is cheaper to build a villa or a duplex. Often it is actually more expensive. So it doesn't make any sense to us, but that's just the way it is. And we've got to live with that.
And vice versa, Debbie, moving to apartments now. Why is the incomes for apartments per participant higher? Is there an answer there either?
No.
So for the apartments, we're looking at as an average, I don't know, 70 to 110 grand for 1 participant per apartment. And it's very rare to see 2 residents funding for apartments and 2 residents living in an apartment. We see the apartments as 1 tenant participant in the house, in the apartment, and 1 spare room, and that's the norm pretty much. And then that is the highest funding for SDA housing as the apartment side there, then houses, and then duplexes, villas. Yeah. That's all I should cover on this topic in this page, Debbie. Anything else to move before we move on?
Look, it's just really important to understand that the funding is related directly to these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14 different dwelling types. And the funding in a participant's plan will be, again, one of these funding levels, one of these 14. So that the house is enrolled as one of these, and the participant's funding is one of these.
There's a question in our Q&A, Debbie, from Woody. What are the advantages of apartment compared to houses? Why is apartments have higher income? Will this come down in the future? O.O.A apartment doesn't need to have a separate room for O.O.A. Do you want to answer that?
Sure. The advantages of apartments, the main advantage we see is that you're going to be able to build apartments in the inner and the mid-ring areas of the metro cities where it's not feasible, or it's just too hard to find suitable land to build a house or a villa. So it answers the undersupply of SDA housing in those areas. Additionally, we know 45% or nearly 45% of participants, whilst they may not have single resident funding in their plan, they want to live on their own. So that creates that housing that people want to have. Again, why apartments have higher income, we're really not sure on that. Will it come down in the future? Possibly. We had 18 months coming up for 2 years ago, there was a 5-year price review of SDA funding, and the apartment funding did drop then. It dropped in some cases up to about 20%. So, and there's nothing to say that it won't drop again in the future. But I would say it's still going to remain relatively high compared to houses. The OOA apartment, does it need to have a separate room for an OOA? No. In an apartment scenario, the OOA is a separate room in the apartment complex, and up to one OOA for up to 10 units in the complex. So if there's more units, you need more OOA rooms. So the concept is that the carers on site will operate out of that room as their office and be providing the overnight supports to the different tenants in those apartments they're looking after, essentially. We do know of cases where a participant is living in an apartment and they choose not to use the on-site supports. They have their own carers, and their own carers do stay in the apartment with them. So whilst it's not really designed for that, it does sometimes get used for that situation. But generally, it's going to be separate on-site support, separate OOA in an apartment complex.
Wonderful. Moving on, next slide.
Okay.
So the breakdown of ratio weightings of participants in the different categories and also the funding types. Debbie, I'll let you go into this before me and Denise take over the financials next
Sure.
slides. Yeah.
All right. So if you know anything about SDA, you should know that there are 4 different design categories: high physical support, fully accessible, improved livability, and robust. And below those 4 boxes, you'll see the approximate number or percentage of SDA funded tenants with each type of category. Just very quickly to break it down, the first 2, high physical support and fully accessible, generally people in wheelchairs with mobility issues. Improved livability will be a mix of people with mild psychosocial, with intellectual, cognitive, and other impairments. So they're not necessarily got physical impairments where they need a wheelchair accessible house, but they need a house designed for them so that they can live in that house themselves more independently. They can understand their surroundings better. Robust, as it kind of, what it says on the box, it is built more robust, tougher for people with complex behaviors and needs. Roughly, the wheelchair accessible properties are going to, or the wheelchair accessible participants are going to be roughly 50% of the mix, and the other 50% between improved livability and robust. Also important to understand that if you build a home, so the categories relate to both the dwellings, they're built to these categories, and the participants are funded for these categories. So they're funded, the dwellings and the participants' funding is completely matched, if you know what I mean, if you understand what I'm saying. If you build a high physical support home, it can accommodate people with fully accessible and improved livability funding as well. Again, like HPS, a fully accessible designed property can accommodate people with IL. IL is the bottom level of design, so it can only accommodate people with IL funding. Robust is a little bit of a standalone type of dwelling, but it also does suit participants with IL funding. So that's why we have seen the majority of properties in the market have been built to high physical support. Not a problem, because basically 90% of participants can potentially live in that home. So I hope that sort of makes it a bit clear with all the different dwelling types, design, funding that a participant might have, and how it works together. Now, the other thing that's really important to understand is the funding a participant receives. And in that bottom box, 1-to-1 funding, 1-to-2 funding, 1-to-3 funding, simply means 1-to-1 that the participant is funded to live on their own. 1-to-2, they're funded to live with one other in a 2-resident dwelling. 1-to-3, they're funded to live with 2 others in a 3-resident dwelling. So having those basics, an understanding of that, will lead us into our more complex overview of all the different income scenarios and tenancy mixes.
Debbie, we have a good question from Tim in our audience. He asks, how is the funding changing as in participants to carers, as in there used to be a lot of one-to-one funding previously? I have a robust under construction and it's designed for one robust participant per side as in a duplex. Will I still be able to get participants on a one-to-one funding, or will that change?
Very, very good question, Tim. So we do know the NDIS are more likely to fund participants for share funding, simply because they're trying to, cost cuts and cut costs and reduce the budget. So not too many participants are getting that one-to-one funding outright, and initially when they apply for SDA. And that is why we have seen so many cases going to appeals within the NDIS to get the funding changed, or if that fails, eventually ending up in the AAT, where I have to just mention that I think it's something like 98% of cases that have gone to the AAT have ended up in the participant's favour. So that kind of, I guess, really says that the NDIS are very bullish in trying to pay less. But at the end of the day, if the participant can prove, or their carers and their supports can prove they really do need to live on their own, they will get their funding increased to that. Having said that, once your duplex has been completed and you start getting applications for tenancy, there's a good chance that you will only get applications from participants with lower funding, with 1-to-2 funding or 1-to-3 funding. And there is nothing to say they can't then, if you accept them to move into the house with the lower income initially, they can then apply for a change of circumstances and have their funding increased. There was actually a podcast that was recorded yesterday with Minh and a provider that goes into that exact situation. So I think that will be released next week. So keep your eye out for that, and that'll explain better
That will
how
be
that
released hopefully
happens.
this Friday,
This
and it
Friday.
covers S100, S48, change of circumstances for those who are in 1-to-3 funding applying to be 1-to-2, or those in 1-to-2 funding applying to be 1-to-1. It explains the whole process of going through that government process, which takes normally 6 months to a year for those changes. Yeah.
Mm. There's a few more questions here I just want to very quickly touch on. Buddy, can we build a house for 3 HPS and register for only 2? Yes, absolutely, you can do that.
Yes.
So whilst the house might have been built with 3 tenant bedrooms, it can absolutely be registered as a 2-tenant house. We see a lot of that happening because that way you can potentially get the higher funded participants in there.
Debbie, I want to correct your answer there. Almost correct. If you have a 3-tenant house, you can register as a 3-tenant house or a 2-tenant house or a 1-tenant villa. So all the above there, yes.
Yes, that's correct. And Wendy, hi Wendy. Do we know the stats on the percentages of how many across HPS are funded for 111213? No. In a word, no. Unfortunately, we do not. We get some fantastic data from the NDIS. in terms of supply, less data in terms of demand. And this is information we just cannot get. Unfortunately, it would make the development of SDA around Australia far more precise. But we unfortunately have to deal with the information available to us.
Can I give my gut feeling answer for Wendy as well? The default funding is 1 to 3. So, the government, the NDIA, will fund participants for SDA at 1 to 3. If it's housing, 1 to 3, default, and probably for villas, 1 to 2. It's up to the responsibility is on to the participant and their family to push for and fight for the higher rate of funding. It comes down to that. So I would say majority for housing participants, 1 to 3 is default, is majority. Yeah, that's the answer. Because the likelihood of them giving 1-to-1 funding for apartments is going to be very low chances unless you really prove. And I'll give you an example here to Wendy and Eddie asking the same questions here. Let's say I'm a participant, just to make a very simple example here. I'm a participant. I live in a group home with 3 or 4 people myself. I'm sharing, but I'm divorced and I'm in a wheelchair and I have 2 kids, right? It's unfair for me to bring my 2 kids over for sleepovers on the weekends, sharing it in a house full of 3 other blokes or 2 other blokes in the same house. It's not feasible. So therefore, I apply for, as a participant to the NDIS, for a change of circumstances to be living in an apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, 1 spare room, so that my kids can come over to visit me on weekends as a parent who's disabled. So under those rules, maybe there's a high chance there of getting that approved, maybe. In contrast to if I was unemployed, single, no kids, and I'm sick of living in a group home, I just want to live in an apartment just because I want to, that's denied straight away, because there's no reason why the government should spend more money on supports and also accommodation just because I want to live in an apartment on the Gold Coast by myself. No way. You've got to really have justified justified reasons why it's suitable to your lifestyle and yourself as a participant in the NDIS to have that privacy, independence by yourself in an apartment for 1-to-1 funding, as compared to living in a 1 to 3 house. Yeah.
And it comes down to the NDIS terminology of reasonable and necessary.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, I think we should move on to the next slide. And this is taking it into Denise and Minh to go through. Oops, I've just gone too far. To the actual tenancy mixes.
This is a very peculiar rule, and not many people know about this, the lesser of rule, okay? So go back to 1 to 3, 1 to 2s, right? The default funding for SDA for housing or group homes is 1 to 3. So which means a carer plus 3 participants in a house. And let's say it's going to be, as an example, only 50 grand, 50,000, 50,000, 50,000. So that is the way the estate provider enrolls the house for 1 carer and 3 participants for $50,000 each. And let's say coming along many months later, there's a participant who is 1 to 2 funding in HPS at $90,000, right? For 1 to 2 funding, living with 2 participants. So 2 tenants only. They come along and they apply for the house, the said house of 4 bedrooms, which is carer plus 3. And they say, I've got 90 grand income, I'm 1 to 2 funding, I'm applying for it. The lesser of rule is the lesser of those 2 numbers. So the lesser of 50,000 versus 90,000. Because the NDIS funded enrollment for this house is 50,000 per person, that's the lesser of rule. If 2 guys come along with 90,000 each, who are flatmates, and they're saying, here's our 90-90, because the house is enrolled as 1 to 3, the lesser of is 50, 50, 50. So all you get is $50,000 each. The way around it is if the estate provider unenrolls the house and re-enrolls it again as a 1 to 2 tenant house, 2-tenant house, okay? And vice versa. If you have a guy who is in a villa funded person for, let's say, $35,000 in an IL category approval, in a villa, 1 to 2 villa as an example, and they come along to this house, which is enrolled as 3 participants at 50, 50, 50, the lesser of rule applies. 35 is the winner. Well, the loser. The loser is an investor going to get 35,000, not 50,000. The lesser of rule. So in theory, you might get a $90,000 1 to 2 participant coming in, applying, a $50,000 1 to 3 participant applying, and a $35,000 IL 1 to 2 applying. The lesser of rule always applies, the lesser of number. Okay. And not many people understand this rule until after the fact. So just because you build a 2-tenant house doesn't mean you'll get that 90,000 average. It's always the lesser of rule. Okay. What else? Is that clear enough, Debbie, on that topic there?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think so. It's
that pretty
pretty
much covers the
straightforward.
entire slide here, doesn't it? That very topic there. Cool.
Right.
Moving on.
Tenancy mix.
Welcome, Denise. Where are you, Denise? Are you hiding somewhere in the background?
Hi, Minh.
Denise, you created this this summary here for us the last few months. Can you explain to us how you came about this and what it means and all that kind of stuff, please?
Yeah, all right. So this is a color-coded sample of all the potential tenancy combinations for a 3-resident enrolled house plus OA. So there are up to 83 potential tenancy scenarios for this specific dwelling. Yeah, so there's 6 mixes, 6 scenarios for 1 resident, which includes a house HPS 123 funding, house FA 123, since this is a 3-resident enrolled house. Does that make sense? Yeah, so yeah, as shown in the image, we also consider the possibility of having participants under a Villa 1 to 2 SDA funding, factoring in the lesser of rule that Minh mentioned before. So using that example, if you look at the next page, the next slide, our calculations can actually estimate all the potential income and yield from all these different tenancy mixes. So we're not able to fit all the 83 scenarios in here. So, but yeah, the first 6 scenarios are only with 1 tenant, then 21 scenarios with 2 residents, and 56 with 3. Here we only show scenarios up to 25 at the most.
And can I just add that whilst we've pulled together 83 scenarios there, we haven't included participants who've got group home funding. So there are actually a whole lot more there. We've just narrowed in on sort of the more likely funding amounts in participants' plans.
Can I also add to what Denise is saying here, Debbie? See the scenario 1 there, house HPS 1 to 3 plus 0 plus 0. This assumes 1 tenant and 2 empty rooms in the 4-bedroom house. Okay. If you have it as a maximum return here, to be honest, 66 times 3 is $198,000 on that 1.2 million, which is high, obviously. 198 divided by 1.2 is about, what's that? Almost 20%. But that's unrealistic. And Debbie, do you explain to our audience why any investors who assume a max return of HPS is unrealistic? Please explain that.
Yeah,
please.
well, it goes back to thinking about the number of tenants out there with their funding levels. So if you remember back a few slides ago, around 30% of participants are expected to be funded for HPS. Now, the majority of them are going to be funded for 1 to 3, we assume, or maybe 1 to 2. So you're also going to have an oversupply of HPS houses in a lot of areas. Now, especially in an oversupplied area, you're not going to get 3 participants with HPS funding to get into your one house because they've got a huge range of properties to choose from to live in, and they're not going to choose to live with 2 other people when there's an empty house down the road. So it just literally comes down to the supply of tenants in the area. 30% only have HPS funding to start with, and less will have the funding. So we're talking about a 3-resident house. So that is going to be the majority of HPS funded participants probably, but To get 3 of them in one property, very unlikely, unless your property is in a high demand area where there's no other properties. We're talking about places like a lot of suburbs in Sydney, in maybe inner parts of Melbourne, rural areas where there's maybe only a few homes out there and there are a lot of participants and there's no other choice for them. So we do know of houses that are fully tenanted with the highest funded participants, but in most cases, you're not going to get that.
Thank you, Debbie. Just continuing on more on this slide here. I want to throw a confusing curveball to investors or our audience here, and that is, imagine you have a 4-bedroom house, R.O.I plus 3 tenants, 3 participants. You get a 1 to 2 HPS funded person, a 1 to 3 FA person house, and a 1 to 2 IL villa. Okay, you can get any one of these scenarios or mixes in here, and that's why, as Debbie said, there's 83 examples here, right? And it's, again, the lesser of rule. The lesser of rule applies, yes, true, but compatibility, Debbie, personality compatibility. You want to explain that topic? That's also important to address, because why is it empty sometimes here, where there's 2 rooms empty? Compatibility, please explain that.
Absolutely. Okay. Firstly, you've got to understand these properties are not just a house for one of these participants to live in for a year or 2. Like, when we're young, we're out renting with friends or with other people, we move on. This is their forever home. This is going to be where they're living for the rest of their life. So what you have is the first tenant who moves in is what we call the anchor tenant. And ideally, you've got a good anchor tenant who is an easygoing person and can share with other people, but that's not always easy to find. So to find a second tenant, they've got to be obviously compatible with that first tenant. Personality-wise, they've got to get on together. A lot of the time, you're going to need to have the same sex, because you don't want to have male and a female sharing, but that might be an issue for them. But just as important as personality matching is supports matching. Ideally, they're going to be looked after by the same care provider, and that care provider might not have that many clients to be able to find 2 who go together well in the one house. So that adds in a whole nother level of complications if you've got to find a separate carer.
But Debbie, here's a silly question. Why can't we have 2 care providers in the same house? Why not?
You can, but it is a much more complicated thing to set up rosters and to have both of those care organizations, companies, operating in the same house. It's done. It is done in some cases, and we know some SDA providers who manage it and some SIL providers who are happy to work with different organizations with clients in the one dwelling, but it's not a common situation.
I want to ask Denise a trivia question here to get her involved in our conversation. Denise, are you there?
Yes, Minh.
If a house, I call it HPS house, 4-bedroom, R.O.I plus 3 residents own a house, the care provider on site, how many staff do you think are required to manage that 3-tenant house?
2?
No, 13.
What? I'm
13
sorry, what?
staff.
No way.
We've spoken to many other providers out there who have 13 staff to manage a 3-resident, 4-bedroom house. Yes.
That's insane. Okay. Wow.
When you thinking about it, Denise, you might have different types of supports for each different individual in the house. You might have people coming in to take them out to community access, to coming in to help out with activities in the house, in the backyard, like part-time, full-time, casual staff, 2 and 1.
And 3 shifts a day.
3 shifts a day as well, right?
Okay.
So 8, I reckon 8 to 12, 8 to 10 is a reasonable number of staff for a 3-tenant house. That's just feedback from other providers. Yeah.
And that, of course, depends on the requirements of each tenant in the house. But that will give you an understanding of the complexity of matching the participants in that house, because they've got to have the supports have to be compatible to a degree. The care teams have to be compatible, hopefully the same care team. So it's one tenant is relatively easy to find for a house or a multi-tenant property like a villa, or rarely an apartment that would house 2 tenants. But getting that second tenant or a third tenant in, much more difficult.
Debbie, there's a great question from Charles, and I want to answer this question. Is there a difference between carers and OOA? Charles, love the question, and I love to answer this question. The word OOA means the following: on-site overnight assistance. Now, that doesn't mean carer. The OOA word is a room. It's a room, okay? The OOA room, not the OOA person, okay? So you might have one OOA room and four carers on site at the same time. So that is a difference right there, okay? Moving on.
Next slide.
All right.
Is okay.
Debbie,
This is showing us,
yeah,
straight out of the NDIS pricing guideline, SDA price guideline.
And this is a location factor, I assume, of 1.00, which
this
is
is 1.0,
the number, because questions came up from some of the guys in the Q&A room. I think, Charles, is location a big impact? What is it, TAP? Is it really? And blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, as we know, location factors are 5 to 8% above and below 1.00, 0.92, 1.03, 1.3, 0.85. It depends on the location. Debbie, what is the theory behind the location factor? Because sometimes you and I can't even figure out why they have again, this is for Wendy's in Perth knowledge. North Perth is lower than Southeast Perth, you know, for example, different areas. Why is that?
So when they did the price review back in 2023, they published a long document. I'm sure you can find this on the NDIS website somewhere still, going into the methodology behind creating those location factors. And there were a whole lot of different things that they included to come up with their end figure, from build costs, from land costs, I think also participant numbers. There was many different things that went into their calculations, but at the end of the day, they still didn't make sense a lot of the time. Where, for an example, I use this one all the time because it is such a good picture. Most people know what the Gold Coast looks like. They know roughly how big it is, you know, runs from maybe 40 k's south of Brisbane CBD down to the border of New South Wales. It's quite a large area. It has a very diverse demographic, from lower socioeconomic areas right through to really expensive areas right on the coast, your surfers, your broad beaches, all those sorts of areas. The location factors are based on what's known as an SA4, a statistical area which comes straight off the ABS data, Australian Bureau of Statistics. The entire Gold Coast is one SA4. So there's one location factor that applies. So whether you're trying to develop a property in Broadbeach that's going to be on a block of land that costs you $2 million to buy, or whether you're developing a property up in Ormo that is costing you $400,000. I don't know what the cost of land is. That's probably more now, but you know, a significantly cheaper block of land, your income is the same, essentially, because the location factor is the same. That doesn't make sense. So it does help in some areas. For example, parts of Sydney have a location factor of 1.8. So it's nearly doubling the income. but it still doesn't account for the incredible cost of buying land in Sydney and developing in Sydney. So, yeah.
Debbie, I think my 2 cents worth on this topic is really land cost. The location factor is a way to reimburse for the extra hefty price of going to Bondi versus Cabramatta, for example, right? But it also, this is back to Tim, who's asking questions here about location factor. It's the government's way of manipulating the movement of investors around Australia. Because if you lower or increase, or if you manipulate the location factor by 5-10%, because Tim asked if it's 1.00 plus currently, could it drop to 0.8 in the future? The answer is yes. It can always change. The government will modify those numbers every 5 years or every year or so to affect demand by investors, because they know investors will chase the higher return, higher location factors. If they manipulate that, it will impact upon the.
I believe that probably did have what was one of the things that they considered in the creation of those location factors was, well, I said demand, but also supply.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So back to this, have we discussed this so far? This spreadsheet here.
So I think this is fairly self-explanatory. Obviously, we've got on the left there the different dwelling types: apartments, villa duplex houses, group homes. And then the categories: improved livability, fully accessible, robust with breakout room. I don't think we'll go into that today. That's a minor little thing. High physical support. So you can see if you're looking at a house, 2 bedrooms, a 2-resident house, these are the different funding levels for each category. So it differs between for IL to HPS. We're only looking at $9,500 difference between the lowest and the highest category. So, or 14,000 for a 2-resident. I was looking at the 3-resident houses. So that's basically the price guide and what it is. This is just one of a few different categories, because there's also a chart that is for without sprinklers. GST is paid.
Next slide, Debbie. Next slide gives more detailed analysis. Just go next door.
This is the actual what the calculator looks like.
Sorry guys, before I move on, we have a Neeraj who's asking us to clarify about the lesser rule. He had if one participant is HPS funded at 90K per annum and another at IL at 50K per annum, is the total funds for the 2 participants at 100K, or will the HPS funded still be receiving HPS?
It depends on what the house is enrolled for, Denise. If the house is enrolled for 1 to 3 HPS, it'll be 50 per person, the lesser of rule. That's the answer.
So what if it's a 2-resident house and then there's
if it's enrolled as a 2-resident house at 90 and 90 as the numbers going in, and someone comes in at 50,000 HPS 1 to 3, and someone comes in at 1 to 2 IL villa funding at 35,000, it's 35 and 50, not 90s. It's the lesser of the 2 numbers. That's all it is.
Yeah, thank you.
So this is the actual SDA calculator that you can download straight off the NDIS website. It's updated twice a year. The income is updated. The actual SDA amount is updated once every year. The MRRC is updated twice a year. MRRC stands for Maximum Reasonable Rent Contribution. That is what the participant actually pays in rent, made up of their disability support pension and their Commonwealth rent assistance. Now, I think to make this a bit clearer so that you can play around with this calculator yourself, I want to actually share the calculator itself so you can see how it works. So just bear with me while I bring this back up. Okay, I hope you can see my calculator now. By the way, it doesn't work very well in Google Sheets if you use that. It tends to be needed to be run on Excel. Okay, so this is a calculator that is for this year, the 2024-2025, updated in June 24. There should be a new one coming out imminently with the new MRRC. So what we have here, and we're all really concerned about when we're looking at new build properties that are currently under construction or close to it, is post-2023 new build. Talking about house with 2 residents, we can actually change this to any of those 9, 4, 11 types of category. Here is where you change it between the IL, FA, robust, HPS, with or without R.O.I, with or without fire sprinklers, and tax credits. Generally, for most people buying a property, you're not going to be claiming GST input tax credits. So our standard would be, if it's in New South Wales, or more increasingly new builds in Queensland, WA and Victoria, you hopefully do have fire sprinklers, and almost always there's going to be an OOA property. So this would be the standard calculation. Here is where you select your location factor. So if we're talking about, as I said, the Gold Coast, click on that, and we've got a location factor of 0.9 on the Gold Coast. Now, this one doesn't make sense because there's not enough supply on the Gold Coast, especially closer to the beaches, the areas where it's going to be expensive to construct and develop. And the income being reduced by 0.1%, 0.10, doesn't make sense. Anyway, it is what it is.
Can you show me Bondi, Debbie? Bondi Beach?
I'll show you Bondi, which would be in New South Wales, Sydney, eastern suburbs, 1.9. I said 1.8 in Sydney, 1.9. There you go. So that kind of makes a bit more sense, although I still think that it's not going to compensate you for developing something in Bondi. But that's how it works. So down the bottom here, you've got a few tabs as well. Those location factors, you can actually just click on that tab and see for every SA4 in Australia what the location factors are. And you'll see they actually differ between the dwelling types. So if we look at Melbourne West, 0.98 for apartments, 0.97 for villas. So that one's pretty standard across the board, but some vary quite drastically. Here we go. In the WA wheat belt, 1.18 and 7 and 1.2 for apartments, down to 1 virtually on the mark for villas, and under 1 for houses and group homes. So the location factors don't always make sense, but they're all that we've got to work with at the moment. If you also want to understand again what MRRC is, as you can see, it's made up of predominantly of the disability support pension and the Commonwealth rent assistance. And this figure, which is 12,838, go back to the calculator, sits there, 12,838. That is the same amount every single participant is required to pay. Every SDA participant in Australia should be paying that amount. So that can always be calculated into the total income received. So 175 SDA plus 12,838, 188. So that's
Debbie,
how
good
the
question.
calculator works.
Quick question. Vasco's asking, can you advise the link as to where we can find this calculator?
Absolutely. So I'll go back to sharing the PowerPoint. And we actually have the sorry, bear with me. Okay. So this is the link. Oops. Sorry. I might get Denise to pop that link into the chat to send it to everybody.
No problem.
So you can get that, but we'll also list that when we send out this presentation for everybody. It's a good page to keep bookmarked.
Debbie, a good question from Tim. He has a dumb question. If a new building comes online 2024, does that funding keep changing from year to year, completely, say, 2025, if it gets reduced, or does your original remain in place plus CPI increases?
So when your house was built, whatever that income is what gets paid with the CPI increases. Now, we expect that every 5 years that SDA funding review is going to happen. And so we're going to be looking at mid-2028 for the next one. And as we saw back in 2023, there were some significant changes in the SDA funding, but that only applied, as it says there on the calculator, post 2023. So any properties that were pre-2023 weren't affected by the new incomes. So in some cases, that would have been a good thing if the apartment funding was in place, because the apartment funding went down. But for people who had particularly IL and FA properties, the funding went up hugely. And people who had older properties, unfortunately, didn't get the benefit of that. So when the next price review kicks in, it's going to only be for properties that are enrolled from when that price review comes out, as far as we know, because that's what happened last time. So yeah, were there any more questions relevant to the calculator and how this works? I think there was one thing I also wanted to just quickly show. How do you find out what the SA4 location is? Just again, bear with me while I bring up a page to show you where we find it. It is actually from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and this is a really good resource. I will share this screen.
Keep those questions coming, everyone. We'll get through them by the very end of the session.
So as you can see straight off the ABS website, this is where you can find the statistical area for SA4, and we do the SA4 and the SA3 generally when we're looking at an area, because all of the data on SDA that the NDIS put out is based on these two regions. If I scroll in, let's go to somewhere in Melbourne, and if I want to know what SA3 and SA4 South Morang is in, let's just click in there. It's telling me it's in the Melbourne Northeast, SA4. And if you are looking into the data, which is a whole nother topic, and you want to know the SA3 area, the Whittlesea Wallen SA3. So that's just a little tip on how to determine the SA4 when you're using that calculator and you want to know what the SA4 is. So I hope that's clear for everybody. You just need to go to ABS Maps on the ABS website. Okay, so back to the presentation.
Yes, the numbers now. Next slide, Debbie.
Sorry, am I sharing? No, I'm just sorry, I've got an issue here.
That's okay. The next slide, as Debbie's preparing for it, will be our calculations we think are needed capital funding for getting into an SDA. As we said earlier, at the very start of this webinar, a lot of people don't understand the true costs involved in actually getting ready to buy or settle a property. Here it is. This is from our honest opinion as to what is required: deposit, LMI, cash buffers, provider fees. And look, this is not a calculator for the purposes of getting a loan or getting finance approval. This is what we think are all the costs required to prepare for your acquisition and prepare for your lending and purchase costs, right? So this is assuming an 80% LVR, 20% deposit on a $1 million purchase. the legals, the rates of insurance to purchase it, because, you know, this is money to spend even after settlement, right? Provider fees of engagement, procurement fees, a furniture package is often the norm these days. The interest costs, as in interest only costs of construction during construction. The buffer you need if it's empty. We've seen stories of when people settle their house in SDA purchase completion and they sell it 5 months later because they have no money to pay for the empty house with no income. It does take, you know, 5 to 8 months, 5 to 10 months to fill up a house. It takes time, you know. And if you don't engage an SDA provider to source and market for participants early in the piece, as in 6 months before completion, you'll end up with an empty house for a much longer period of time. So get in there early. Continuing on, stamp duty. This is a Victorian transaction, and the stamp duty in Victoria a little bit different. So there's a higher cost there of stamp duty costs. Just the lending cost there, all up 20 grand plus, well, actually 20 grand there, plus legals, LMI, construction admin fee, valuation fees. That's a fair bit of money there, right there, right? So this, if you're working your R.O.I, be aware that you should cover in your calculation all costs relevant to the acquisition and post-settlement of your property. So in theory here, I mean, look, you're saying 1,020,000. Well, hang on, 1,020,000 plus everything else in this list here that hasn't been accounted for. And that's why, if you go to the next slide, please, Debbie, next slide, you will see in our spreadsheet a construction timeline here. Hey, Debbie, on your screen here, can I move the image of the speak of you, because it's hiding my bottom right corner of my spreadsheet here.
Oh, you just drag that?
I'll remove it. That's fine. Done. Anyway, this spreadsheet here is another example of, you know, a house and land contract purchase, and it shows the drawdown payments and payment schedules of contract, legals, provider engagement, rates for the block of land that you actually own, construction drawdown payments over this 7-8 month period here, 8-month period, I guess. Ongoing fees. I mean, it shows everything, and then also the P&I. Hey, Debbie, this here doesn't show the interest only. What's missing here in the spreadsheet, row number holding costs, is the interest costs every month for the loan there. That's what's missing here. But other than that, the P&I payments here is 5,000 a month after settlement. There you go. So even though it is a 650,000 build contract price, you see here total costs. I reckon if you add another 2.5, 3 grand a month of ongoing payments every month during the interest only of the loan, there's probably another 25, 30 grand extra there. So about 745,000 is the potential total costs before even income coming in. So 745, 750 compared to the 650 contract price there for build there. Okay. Have I made it all clear, Debbie? Is it anything more to cover on this topic here?
All right, I was muted. Yeah, I think that covers the basics of how this works when we do our feasibility calculations. Obviously, we make sure everything's right, but it will give you a real idea of all the expenses and what your total expected expenditure is going to be.
Next slide, please, Debbie.
There it is.
Okay, here we go. Yeah. Can you explain it, Debbie? I'm having a coffee break now. Your turn.
So what we've done here is based on that contract price of 900,000. I actually think we've got these figures back to front, but anyway, we did this very quickly last night. Apologies, everyone. But you get the gist of, so we'll ignore that last 3 rows there, columns there. We're guessing different for a 2-resident home. We're guesstimating the most likely scenarios for a tenancy mix.
Can
Well,
I ask Denise a question? For that 3-tenant home before with 83 outcomes, what is a 2-tenant home outcomes number going to be? Do you know, Denise? Roughly?
Rough, not at the moment, no. Sorry, Min.
Well, it'll be lower than 83, right? Probably 60, I reckon. 60
Yeah, would be.
ish. Yeah. But
yeah.
this is a very simplified version of our previous slide that Debbie and Denise went through. If you look at scenario 3 there, it has a 1 to 3 HBS person. So scenario 8, sorry, 8. Scenario 8.
8.
You have a 1 to 3, a 1 to 3 HBS and a 1 to 2 IL guy in a 2-resident home.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, obviously, this one here is a higher location factor. I reckon this is a Perth one, I reckon. But 73,000, and hey, that can't be right. There, it is 86. Yeah, 1 to 2 IL. So in this scenario here, I reckon this is a Perth example here. I reckon it'll be a 1 to 2 HPS house in Southeast Perth, is my guess, right? In Perth, at 95 to 100,000. Because Debbie, remember in Southeast Perth, example, just top of my head here. Forest Sprinkler, Southeast Perth, 2-resident, 1 to 2 enrollment in Southeast Perth is $205,000 income max. Okay, that's why these numbers here at 1 to 3 and 1 to 2 IL and HPS is okay.
160. Yeah. So yeah, 80, average of 80.
Well, there you go. Look up
tenant.
there. Scenario one is 200 grand rent. There you go.
There you go.
So you add in the five. Yeah.
So this is showing you just some of the scenarios of potential incomes, whether they've got 1 to 3 funding or 1 to 2 funding. And this will show you the gross yield and the net yield. And this, of course, is before any mortgage repayments. So you can see, yes, it could be potentially quite low if you only got 2 tenants in there without HPS funding, and they're both at 1 to 3 funding level.
Debbie, there's an error here. There's an error. The column D, E, F is
I said to ignore those. Yeah.
Yes. Bill costs.
Yeah. So it didn't include the total investment cost, which also includes the land cost. So our calculations on the previous slide were not out. So apologies for that. But just this is an idea on how you calculate your ROI. You really need to be very conservative with the potential incomes you're going to get, and include all the extra costs that you're going to be facing, not just the contract price.
Okay, so, moving on from this slide.
Now we're going to be just a little teaser on other service offerings. Min, I know you wanted to talk about this.
Well, me, I'd rather Denise talk because she doesn't not talk much. Denise, I'm dragging you in here. This is explain to us our fee for service service and what we do and what are we seeing in front of us here? 5 of our normal 10. Please explain, please.
Okay. So for SDA developments, aside from the sample we showed earlier, which would be like a 3-resident house, we also look at the overall of what else you can build on a site. What other SDAs there can be, which would include a villa or a duplex or a 2-resident house, all of that. So our feasibility looks at maybe between 4 to 10 building options, depending on your site and your budget. And yeah, we look at the feasibility, the income ROI for all of that, which would be in this matrix that Min's showing right now. Yeah, this specific one also includes the possibility of a granny flat, secondary.
Go back, Debbie, go back in the last slide. So that granny flat there, the image number 2 there you see there, that's probably an IL granny flat in the back of a house somewhere. So it's not it's an SDA granny flat IL because there's no ramps here for wheelchair access. Yeah.
And that would likely be enrolled as a villa.
Yes.
For sure. For funding purposes.
Yeah. So we're seeing more what's the word? Larger blocks with a house, 3-4 bedroom house in the front and then a granny flat in the back. And that granny flat will be seen as a villa outcome. And sometimes there'll be maybe even that could even be a second OOA as well. Maybe. but yeah, it was empty. Yeah. Yeah, but anyway, this here is an outcome where we show clients with bigger blocks and bigger budgets to look at all the scenarios here in front of you. You know, a villa, 4-pack villas, a duplex only, a 2-low set side by side with a splitter block. Could be 2 high set houses. Could with a lift, obviously. An extra large house with upstairs only and downstairs only, 2 different tenancies there. Manor homes, which are extra large houses with 6 to 7 apartments internally of a house, and outside looks like a big massive house, but inside it actually is individual apartments there. So all types of scenarios we actually show investors who are open to larger projects, different outcomes here. Because at the end of the day, as an investor, you want to know, what can I build on my site? What's feasible? What's not feasible? Is my budget? What's possible? So we, as a team here, we also give a lot of SDA advisory on simply developments like this. And the development could be just duplex or 2 houses. That's what it is. Yeah.
But again,
Anything
it all
to
comes
add,
down to the
Denise?
ROI.
Yeah, ROI.
What you're going to get.
And you can see here, look at the yields there. Yields are 4.6 to 10.5% return yields here. Yeah. Anything to add, Denise, on this very topic of our SAS work, SDA advisory services?
Well, we do also include a SDA feasibility word report, which shows all the SWOT analysis of each different options and what we think you should go with, like maybe like the top 2 or 3 recommendations for you. Yeah.
I think we're almost at the end, Debbie. Before we go to the research reports, let's go to the questions here. Questions in the Q&A. How are we going here? Tim, I love Tim's questions. How do you know if an inquiry is genuine for your NDIS house as a potential tenant or just nothing? Since the SDA, when asked to clarify, will not answer that for me. Well, Debbie, I think a genuine application for an EOI for tenancy. So an SDA provider should get an application from a tenant who has funding or no funding to say they want to move into this house. And then the investor should say, well, show me your SDA funding from the NDIS. Obviously, remove the name of the participant and their details. You should be able to get that from an SDA provider.
Absolutely. And I would not be accepting any applications where you are not given the information, like the actual funding in their plan and how much you would be receiving as an investor. Yeah, so if your SDA provider is not giving you that information, it is either not a genuine query or application, or might be other issues involved with your SDA provider. Any more queries here that
Vasco has a question. Feedback from people who have this is state the vacancy period is approximately 1 year. Also, there are shortages, so why so long? What's that question mean, Debbie?
I think, Vasco, are you asking about there's shortages of housing, there's a demand? It all depends on where it is, Vasco. Massive oversupply in many, many areas of Australia now, and undersupply in areas where it is expensive to build and not going to be as feasible or as attractive a development proposition for investors. So yeah, where there's an oversupply, there's going to be vacancy periods, long vacancy periods. If not for your first tenant, for subsequent tenants. Just because if there's more houses, participants are going to choose to go into an empty house, not to share with someone else in a house already tenanted. And how do you find prospective tenants? Well, your SDA provider should be doing that. Another little plug for another of our services. For those of you who are not aware, we have the SDA Housing Assist service. So for people out there who do have properties that are empty, we could potentially help to try and find your tenants. We don't promise anything. We act as a service in addition to your SDA provider, but we do comprehensive marketing and contacting any providers or allied health workers or any other potential people in the area that your house is to advise them to let them know the property is available and find out if they've got any clients that may be potential tenants. But the first step should always be your SDA provider. More queries here. Tim, what's the overall vacancies in percentage per dwellings? Heard it's increasing. That would vary hugely from place to place. At the moment, I think we're probably looking at around about, the last figures I heard was something like, Minh, you might have a better handle on this, but maybe about 8% vacancy rate in SDA. But we're not talking about 8% of SDA dwellings are vacant. We're talking about the overall number of rooms or places available. There's about an 8% vacancy. So most houses, if they're not newly enrolled in the system, are likely to have at least one tenant. So the house isn't vacant, but some of the rooms in the house are.
Isn't it 15% maybe across the whole entire sector? Across the entire sector. I thought I read that somewhere in the Housing Hub report about a year ago, I think. Yeah.
It could be, as we have more and more properties becoming enrolled in bad areas where they're struggling to get tenants. It could be as high as that. I didn't think it was quite that high, but potentially, yeah.
Niraj asked for areas that are oversupplied. Well, West Melbourne for sure, Townsville, North Queensland. For sure.
Basically, yeah, West Melbourne, Southeast Melbourne, North East Adelaide, many parts of Perth, most of Queensland, apart from Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, and West Brisbane. You can download our over and under supply data report from our website. That will give you a bit of a handle on the SA4 regions and where is over and under supplied. So
to the research reports, if you have an area you're thinking about going into, please contact our office, www.nds.property/reports, to engage us to do a report on your suburb or SA4, SA3 region. If you want to do feasibility on a proposed package you've been given by someone else to look at investing and buying, we can also assess that from independently to say good or bad or don't touch, avoid at all costs. If you have a potential project site that you're looking at developing a little development for yourself as an SDA developer investor, we can also give you guidance on assessing that as a development itself and refer you on to SDA assessors, architects, builders, town planners to give you independent report advice as well. So we always advise and recommend people who are looking at doing anything like this, just take your time, don't rush it, speak to the right people, get the advice, and don't be sold. Don't be sold on the dream of a massive 20% return as it shows on Facebook. Do not believe that rubbish. There's a lot of costs involved, there's a lot of risk involved, and it's really your job as an investor to really de-risk the process by just removing as much risk as possible. Right area, right product, right pricing, right providers to deal with, right costs of engagement, right cost to spend, having the right funding, cash buffer to pay for empty house with a mortgage ongoing payments for the next 6 months. Just doing that kind of feasibility work to ensure that you're not going to be stuck in the deep end and stuck in quicksand at the end of the day. Any more questions?
Can I just add on that I don't know if all of you are aware that the lending requirements have recently changed. I won't go into that now, but basically lenders are now requiring proof that investors have been doing their own research and due diligence. And we're now getting a lot of investors coming to us needing reports on an area. And as an example, this is a report that is being accepted by the lenders on the supply and demand data. So this is just an example of one of the reports that we can do. This is a 6 or 7 page report on an area, on a suburb, that will tell you the supply and demand, current as well as the projected future supply and demand, oversupply, undersupply of a particular area you're looking at investing in. So yeah, just a little note on that. Please do reach out to us if you do need any information at all.
Debbie, Niraj asked for a list of those flood areas. I think rather we can give a list of postcodes to avoid in our feedback. Niraj, if you contact our office or email us, Debbie or John can also email you a postcode list that's been banned for lending for SDA. That's a pretty much good indication there as well.
Yeah, that's right. Vasco, the approximate cost of that report, the SDA report, is $440, including GST.
Eddie's asking a question: can SDA providers enter into an early agreement once a development approval is attained? Yeah, the agreement really is a pass-through head lease agreement that's subject to completion, obviously, and enrollment. I mean, it doesn't. I know what you're trying to ask, Eddie, but it ain't going to do much in terms of, you know, giving you reassurance at DA or whatnot. Debbie, any response to that comment there about early agreements with their providers at DA?
It's not going to be a locked-in agreement.
No.
Yeah, it doesn't really mean much.
Yeah.
So there was another couple of questions regarding providers and whatnot. Thomas, hi Thomas. Do you have an indication from SIL providers as to which areas and types of dwelling most in demand? Look, you know, we have connections with a lot of SIL providers around the country and SDA providers who do give us indication on the areas they work in. So like, for example, Melbourne, we have a pretty good handle on what types of dwellings and what categories are in demand and where they are in demand. We probably have less on the ground knowledge in other areas. But also it's really difficult if you're just talking to some SIL providers. A SIL provider will have their client, generally will have the type of clients they work with. So you might speak to a provider that only has robust type participants or clients on their books. So they'll just say, yes, we just need robust. You speak to someone who doesn't deal with that type of client with behavioral issues or whatnot, they'll just say, oh yeah, we need all improved livability or we need all HPS. So it really needs to be more a general gathering of information from different providers, from the SDAs that work with many different SIL providers. It is difficult to get that information. We try and get as much as we can, but I don't think anyone has a complete handle on it around the country. Eddie and Vasco are both asking about the calculator. If you go to the chat, there is the link to the NDIS page. I will actually do a screen share and show you where to find that. So I've clicked on that link. It's taken me straight to the NDIS page. If you scroll down, you will find there's a PDF, there's the Excel file, the SDA price calculator, and that will save it straight. So again, that was just who was asking about the how to adjust the calculator to show this, which drop-down box. So again, yeah, you literally just, I'm not quite sure you were asking Eddie which adjustment, but if you just play around with this, you'll see all the different drop-down boxes have all the options that are possible to choose. So I hope that is fairly clearly, and you want to be on the main first tab calculator there. So I hope that is clear. Happy to, oh, Eddie was asking about the 111213 funding. That is the number of residents per house. So 1-to-1 will be apartment, 1 bedroom, 1 resident, or villa duplex townhouse, 1 resident. 1-to-2 will be 2 resident villa or 2 resident house. 1-to-3 will be 3 resident villa, 3 resident house. So I hope that makes sense.
Debbie, there were a question from Wendy from Perth. When interviewing potential SDA providers, do you need to ask what participants and their funding are on their books, as well as what participant and their funding are on their wait list? Look, you can ask the question, you can ask whether they have anything positive to say or will they disclose it to you. That's another thing. If you're engaged with them, I think if you're engaged to sign up with them directly and you're working together, then I'm sure they'll be very open to sharing information like that. If you're a outside of ringing up for a cold call to them. I don't think they will share the information to you, because they'll get these calls every day from lots of people asking the same question, and they don't want to share the information. It's all confidential, obviously. It's all about engaging, working with them. And look, they might be honest and say, look, we have nothing in the moment, nobody. We'll work in the background and try and assist you, fill up your house when it's built. Yes. But it's all, you know, as Debbie and I keep on saying to each other, it's hard for a provider, a SIL provider, to actually have 3 SDA participants ready to go at the same time into one house. Anchor tenant first, and then we'll see what happens from there. That's the reality of the whole process. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, tenanting is a slow process. If you are in an area where there is high demand, it will be quicker, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get a tenant in the first month. And certainly it will still take time to get your subsequent tenants for all the reasons that we've already discussed. So I hope that helps, Wendy. Talk to us more if you need that clarified. That is all the questions that we have. I hope that that has answered everything you're not sure about today. I hope that this has cleared things up a little. I'm sure that it may have confused people a little bit more because it is a very, very complex thing, and we've taken years to get our heads around this, literally. So look, if you've got any more questions on this, we are always happy to clarify, to discuss with you anything that you want to know about SDA. You can reach us on 1300 254 397 or drop an email at info@ndis.property. And those details were on the previous slide. As I said at the beginning, everyone will get a copy of this recording as well as a copy of the slides.
And Debbie, make sure we edit the error in those columns.
Yeah, we'll fix that up so
and
you
then
get the
correct version right there as well. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Apologies again for that. So I think that wraps it up today. This went a lot longer than we were expecting. So thanks for staying with us, everybody. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your Tuesday lunchtime. And we look forward to seeing you with our next webinar in about a month.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.